Hello. Welcome to the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. We have another story for you today. Today's story comes from somewhere in Europe, and it is a story about two children who were very resourceful and took care of each other. This is the story of the witch and the children. Once long ago, there was a man, and he had a wife and two children. They were twins. Their names were Martin and Brigitte. Now, sadly, Martin and Brigitte's mother died. And after a while, their father decided that he would get married again so that he would have a wife who could help him with the children and help him with the housework. Unfortunately, the woman that he married didn't really like doing housework. She was a little bit lazy, and she felt like the children were just making extra work for her and were not any help at all. Even though Martin and Brigitte tried to help, they just didn't know how to do most things. They hadn't been taught yet. Well, as often as she could, their new stepmother would send them off to visit their grandmother. And they would go to visit Granny, and they were so happy to visit Granny. But you see, Granny felt that children should be in their own homes. Not always with her. They should be at their own house most of the time, helping with things around the house. And so she would only keep them for a little while, and then she would send them home. Well, after a while, the stepmother tired of this. And so she told the children, "I have a granny too, you know, and I think it would be wonderful if you were to go and to visit my grandmother. She lives in the dearest little house deep in the middle of the forest. Oh, you would love it there. It's so nice. It's so wonderful. And she would teach you all sorts of things, and it would be wonderful. You'll love it. You should go and visit my grandmother." Well, the children were just a little bit afraid of their new stepmother, and so of course they said they would be happy to go and visit her grandmother if she would only tell them the way to go. And so she packed up some of their clothes in little bundles, and she tied them up, and she sent them out the door, and she pointed out to them where the forest path was that would take them to her grandmother's house. Well, as soon as she had gone back in the house, and Martin and Brigitte had begun walking, and their house was out of sight, Martin said to Brigitte, "You know, I think we should go and tell Granny that we're going on a little visit to stepmother's grandmother so that she's not worried about us." And so Martin and Brigitte did. They ran to their granny's house, and they told their granny all about the grandmother that their stepmother was sending them to visit. Well, their granny knew that there wasn't anyone living in that forest except a terrible old witch. And she told the children, "She's not sending you to her grandmother. She's sending you to a terrible witch." And they said, Granny, what should we do? Can we stay with you?" She said, "Well, I would like it if you could, but you know it would only cause problems for your father if you did that. So here's what I think we should do. I think you should still go to visit the witch, but let me think now. You must remember, children, always be polite to the witch and to anyone else in her house. If they're animals or people, it does not matter. Always be very, very polite. You must never be rude to them. And don't eat anything she gives you to eat. I will give you some food so that you can go and stay for a little while and then come home." And so she went and she found a loaf of bread, and she divided it in half and gave each of the children half. And she handed them each a little bottle of milk. And she went to the cupboard and she cut a big piece of ham off of the big ham that she had in the cupboard. She cut it in half, and she gave each of the children half a piece of ham. And then she sent them into the forest. Well, they walked, and they walked, and they walked, and they walked. And you know, the witch's house was so well hidden in the forest that they would have walked right on past it if Martin had not seen a little trail of smoke coming up from behind some of the trees. until they went to the house. Well, when they approached the house, they were both feeling just a little bit scared. A little bit scared. Just a little. Because, well, they knew she was a witch and they didn't know what she was going to look like and if she would look scary or not. And they didn't know how she was going to be. Was she going to be nice or was she going to be mean? Or would she eat them? Or would she just make them be servants? What would she do? Well, they went up. They knocked on the door. And the witch came to the door. And Martin said to her, "If you please, ma'am, our stepmother sent us to visit you. She said you were her grandmother." "If you please, ma'am," said Brigitte, "our stepmother said that if we did whatever you asked, you would be kind to us." Well, the witch, she wasn't a very nice person, as you can imagine. And so she took those children and she grabbed them by their shirts and she pulled them into the house and she pushed them down onto the floor and she said, "Sit there until I find something for you to do. I'll put you to work, all right." Well, Martin, he very nearly said something nasty and rude and he stopped himself just at the last minute. Don't do that. Granny said to be polite. Always be polite. Well, after a few minutes, the witch left the room, and when she came back, she had 2 things in her hands. And when she came back in, she left the door open. And now Martin and Brigitte could actually see her, and they could see that she had a crooked back, and that she was bent and hunched over a bit, and that her hair was all thin and stringy, and that her eyes, she had been a witch for so long that her eyes glowed red like coals in the fireplace. It was rather terrifying. Well, the witch hobbled over to them and she handed Martin a sieve. If you've never seen a sieve, you need to ask your mom and dad to show you one. It's a piece of metal thing. It's a bowl made out of metal that's got all kinds of holes punched in it. So you can put things in it and wash them, and all the water will run out, and all the dirt too. And she handed Martin the sieve and she said, "Here, boy, take this out to the well and fill it with water." And then she handed Brigitte a big pile of wool and she said, "Here, girl, go to the spinning wheel in the corner and spin this into yarn." And then she hobbled out of the house and she walked away into the woods. Well, Martin looked at the sieve and he said, "How am I going to get water in this? As soon as I fill it, it will all run out the holes again." But there was nothing he could do, so he went out to the well to try to fill the sieve. Maybe it was magic. He didn't know. He left Brigitte in the house. Brigitte went over to the spinning wheel, and she had the wool, and she knew it was supposed to work somehow, and she tried her hardest, but she had never been taught how to spin wool into yarn. And so she didn't know how, and nothing worked. And so finally, Brigitte just began to cry. She was tired, she was a little bit hungry, and she was so scared. What would the witch do to her if she came back and she hadn't spun the wool into yarn? Well, while she was sitting there crying, suddenly, out of all the cracks in the floor in the room and under the door, a whole bunch of mice came scurrying in. Little ones and big ones and fat ones and thin ones, all kinds of mice came scurrying in, and they all stopped round her feet. And the biggest ones came up and they just tapped her on the foot, just a little bit. And when she looked up and she saw all those mice, she stopped crying. And the mice said to her, "Little girl, why are you crying?" Well, of course, she wasn't crying right just then, but she had been. And so she said, "Well, the witch has told me that I must spin all of this wool into yarn, and I don't know how, and I've been trying, and I don't know how." And the mice said, "Well, we smell bread. Do you have bread?" And she said, "Well, yes, I do." And they said, "If you will give us just a little bit of your bread, we will spin the wool into yarn for you." And she said, "Oh, if you can do that, you may have it all." And she took the bread out of her pocket and she crumbled it up and she scattered the crumbs on the floor. And all the mice gathered and they gobbled up the crumbs, and then they started spinning the wool. And the fattest of the mice, he went to Brigitte and he said, "Little girl, we want to help you escape from the witch. You've been very kind to us. Go outside and see if you can find the witch's cat. I smell ham. Do you have ham?" And she said, "Well, yes, I do." And he said, "The witch's cat very much likes ham. So if you can give him some of your ham, I'm sure the cat would be glad to show you the way out of the forest." And so Brigitte did. While the mice were spinning the wool into yarn, she went out and she started looking for the witch's cat. She couldn't find it. She looked in every part of the house and she looked all over the yard and all over the gardens. She couldn't find it. So finally, she went and she sat down on the edge of the well next to her brother. Now Martin, all this time, had been trying everything he could think of to try to keep the water in the sieve when he pulled it out of the well, but nothing worked. Every time he got water in the sieve, it ran right back out the holes, and he just couldn't fill the sieve. So finally, when Brigitte came over and sat down beside him, he said, "It's hopeless, Brigitte. I can't get the water to stay in the sieve. It just keeps running out." And she said, "Well, there must be a way to do it, Martin." Well, right about that time, a flock of birds flew down and landed in front of them on the ground. And one of the birds chirped, and much to their surprise, they could understand the bird. And the bird said, "If you will give us some of your bread, we will tell you how you can fill the sieve and keep the water inside." And Martin said, "Well, if you can tell me that, I will give you all the bread I have." And so he crumbled up the bread that he had in his pocket and he threw it on the ground, and the birds pecked it all up. And then they said to him, "You see that ground over there by the witch's garden? That is clay. Gather some of the clay and spread it over the sieve, and it will block all of the holes, and then you can fill the sieve with water." Well, that was a very clever idea, and so Martin did. He gathered some of the clay, and together he and Brigitte filled all of the holes in the sieve so that none of the water could escape. They filled it with the clay, and then Martin filled the sieve in the well, and very carefully he carried it into the house and set it on the table. Well, when he got into the house, Brigitte and Martin saw that the mice had finished spinning all of the wool into yarn. And so Brigitte went and she gathered the yarn and she set it on the table near the sieve full of water. And then, just as she was finishing that, in the door walked the witch's cat. And Brigitte said, "Oh, Kitty, we've been looking for you. The mice told us that you might be able to tell us the way out of the forest. Could you maybe help us? I have some ham. I would be more than happy to share it with you." Well, Martin was happy to share his ham too, and so the cat had quite a feast of a very large piece of ham. And when he was done eating it, the cat said, "I can certainly show you the path out of the forest whenever you are ready to run, and I will also help you out." And he went over to a little cabinet that was standing there, and he pulled open a drawer with his teeth, and he said, "Take the handkerchief and the comb that are there in that drawer." And so Brigitte came over and she picked up the handkerchief and the comb, and she said, "What do I do with them?" And he said, "Put them in your pocket." So she did, and she said, "But what are they for?" And he said, "Well," the cat said, "when you run away from the witch, she will most certainly chase you. And since she has a broomstick and it flies much faster than I'm sure you young ones can run, you are going to need that handkerchief and that comb. When she has begun to get close to catching up with you, throw down the handkerchief and it will turn into a great big lake. and that will at least slow the witch down, and maybe you will be able to escape. But if it doesn't work well enough, then throw down the comb, and it will turn into a great hedge of thorns and briars, and perhaps that will slow the witch down long enough that you can escape." "Well, thank you, Kitty, very, very much," Brigitte said. And just as the cat was turning away, the witch came through the door. Well, she was none too pleased to see that Martin had managed to fill the sieve with water, and that Brigitte had managed to spin all of the wool into yarn. But she hid her anger mostly. And she took a handful of straw and she threw it on the ground and she said, "You may sleep there, and in the morning I will have more jobs for you to do." And the two children laid down on the hay, and the witch said, "Oh, but I forgot, you dear children. Of course you need some supper." And they said, "Oh, no, that's quite all right, miss. We have this milk, and we'll just drink our milk, and that will be plenty for us for supper. Thank you." Well, the witch was not happy to hear that, because she knew that if she had been able to get the children to eat some of her food, they would have had to be her servants forever. But she thought, in the morning, perhaps they would be hungry enough to eat something. What she didn't know is that they only drank one of their bottles of milk. So the next morning, they drank the other bottle of milk. And when the witch came and offered them breakfast, they said they were not hungry just yet, but they were sure they would be later. Well, the witch, she was not too pleased with that, but she went out and she came back with an axe and another pile of wool. And she said, "Here, girl, spin this wool into yarn, and you, boy, take this axe and go chop wood." Well, there was no knowing what that axe might do to Martin, and Brigitte knew that she could not spin any better today than she could yesterday, and they had nothing to give the mice to help them, or the birds to help them, or the cat to help them. And so, they decided it was time to run. It was time to try to escape. And so they did. The cat was waiting for them, and he showed them which path to take to get out of the forest. And they began to run. And run and run and run. They ran as far as they could and as fast as they could to get as far away from the witch as possible before she would find out they were gone and try to chase them. Well, as soon as they had run into the forest, the cat went into the hut, and he sat down next to the spinning wheel. And, there's a pedal underneath the spinning wheel that you can push, and it makes a whirring sound. And so the cat sat down there, and he just pushed on the pedal so that it would make a sound as if someone was spinning. Well, the witch came by, and, witches that are as old as she is, they don't have the best of eyesight. And she didn't want to make the little girl think that she was spying on her, or going to tell her she didn't have to spin anymore. And so she tried to peep in the window of the house to see how far along the spinning was coming. But she wasn't quite tall enough. And so finally she just called out, "Little girl, how is the spinning coming?" And the cat from inside the house said, "Oh, it's coming along, grandmother. Coming along quite nicely." And so the witch went away. But before too much longer, before lunchtime, she came back. And she said, "Little girl, how is the spinning coming?" And the cat said, "Oh, it's coming along quite nicely, grandmother. In fact, it's almost finished." Now the witch knew that there was no way the spinning could be almost finished. She had given the little girl too much wool to spin. And so she knew something was wrong. And so she ran and she burst in the door of the house, and she saw that there was no little girl there. In fact, there was her cat. And she got very, very angry at the cat. And she said, "You are my cat. How dare you argue against me? How dare you work against me? How dare you let them go?" And the cat just looked at her, and the cat said, "I have been with you for years, and you have never given me so much as a fish head. But those children, they gave me their ham, and so I showed them how to get out of the forest. Well, the problem with that was there were several paths that could have led the children out of the forest, depending on where they wanted to go, and the witch had never asked them where they were from. So she asked the cat what road they had taken, but the cat refused to speak. So then the witch ran out of the house, and she called to the birds, and she said, "Birds, birds, the children have escaped. What route did they take?" And the birds said to her, "Well, for years and years we have brought cheer to this gloomy place with our songs and our chatter, and you never gave us so much as a crust of bread. But those children gave us all the bread they had. We will not show you what path they took out of the forest." Well, the witch was not happy with that, but she thought on her broomstick she would still be faster than the children, and she could use just a little bit of magic, and maybe that would help her figure out which path they took. And she used a little bit of magic, and she figured out which path they took. And then she picked up her broomstick and she hopped onto it and she began to fly after the children. Now the broomstick flew faster than the children could run. And I don't know if you've ever tried to run from something for a long time, but after a while you start to slow down a little bit. So the children had been running for quite some time and they were starting to slow down. But then suddenly they heard a strange sound. And Martin said, "Do you hear that?" And Brigitte said, "Yes, it sounds like a swishing and a swooshing." And Martin said, "It's the witch on her broomstick. What are we going to do?" And Brigitte said, "I still have the handkerchief." And she took the handkerchief out of her pocket and she threw it on the ground behind them. And as soon as it hit the ground, it changed and turned into a very big lake. It was so big the children could barely see the other side. "Well, that should slow her down at least," said Martin, and he and Brigitte began running again, this time a little bit faster. Well, the witch came up to the edge of the lake. She couldn't swim over the top of it. That's just the way witches work. They can't go over the top of big water like that. But she could fly around the edge of it. And so she did. And even though it was a very big lake, she still got around it faster than the children could run. And just as they were getting to the edge of the forest, Brigitte said, "Martin, I hear a swishing and a swooshing again." Martin said, "Well, I can see the edge of the forest, and then there's just the meadow, and then we'll be back in the village and we'll be able to get home safely." And Brigitte said, "Martin, the swishing and the swooshing is getting closer. I can't run any faster." Martin said, "Brigitte, do you still have the comb?" Brigitte said, "I forgot about the comb," and she reached into her pocket and she brought out the comb that the cat had given them and she threw it onto the ground behind them. And as soon as she did, a great, big, tall, thick hedge of thickets and brambles and sticker bushes and thorns sprang up out of the ground. It was so long that it looked like a forest, and it was so thick that you really couldn't see through it. And so Brigitte and Martin breathed a little sigh of relief because they were really hoping the witch couldn't get through that fast enough for them to make it home. And so they kept on running. Well, sure enough, as soon as the witch flew up to that hedge of thorns, she tried to go over the top of it, but it was too tall. Every time she tried, it just seemed to get taller. And then she thought maybe she could go around it, but then she realized when she looked it was way too long. So then she tried to go through it, but she got all scratched up and torn and her clothing got ripped, and she did not like that one bit. And so finally, with a screech of rage, she turned around and flew back to her miserable little house in the forest. And Brigitte and Martin, they kept on running until they got home. And when they got home, they found their father sitting outside the house, and they went and they told him everything that had happened about how their stepmother had sent them to visit her grandmother in the forest, but she wasn't really her grandmother. She was a terrible witch, and Granny had saved them by sending food with them, and then they had given the food to the animals, and the animals had helped them to escape. And you know, their father was so upset. that he sent away his new wife, and he told her never to come back. And he decided that it was not a good idea to marry somebody just so she could do the housework and take care of the children. And so from that day on, the father took care of the housework, and Brigitte and Martin helped him. And they had Granny come and teach them the things they didn't know, like how to spin wool into yarn. And they lived a very, very happy life together. And that is the tale of the witch and the children that comes to us from Europe. We hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join us next time, which will be Monday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page. We'll have another story for you. We'll see you later. Bye.